So we should get a prompt in a sec to let us know that it's started. There it is. Awesome. So I'll just do a quick introduction for those that aren't aware of who I am. My name's Corry Cooper. I work for an organisation called Sharing Minds, and I will be your training facilitator today to discuss and demonstrate SharePoint Online and also Teams. So what we'll be doing is talking briefly about consistent file experiences, so what to expect in regards to that. And we'll walk through the SharePoint interface and touch on a few key points. And we'll also do the same with the Teams. This is our second last training session in general, so we do have one more on Thursday. So if I've missed something, or if you want to learn more, by all means, come to the Thursday session. I'm going to ask Quinton to send out a communication to ask people to bring questions to that session. So even if you have been to a previous one, bring questions along to that last session, and we'll try and use that session as a work on your feedback. So you ask a question, we'll go through that scenario and help you learn that part of whatever your question is. So the first thing we want to talk about is just understanding the ecosystem in general of Microsoft 365 and where does Teams and SharePoint sit in that ecosystem. So Teams and SharePoint are both different systems and tools and platforms, but they still live in the Microsoft 365 environment. They have different functions and things that we can do with them, but there is a lot of collaboration and connection between them as well. And we can also see that we've got OneDrive here in that picture. It's because OneDrive may not be the main focus and an area that you'll be working in, but you will see it appear in some instances, primarily in Teams. When you look at files, there'll be a section there that says OneDrive. And so basically OneDrive is still online cloud data, but it's more personal. So it's private to you as an individual, and it's only accessible to other people when you choose to share that information. So it's just important to understand how that actually works. But for organizational information, we go to SharePoint for that. So our controlled documents and our organizational specific data will live in SharePoint, and that's where it will stay and it become the source of truth, which I'll talk about soon. And then we use Teams to lens or connect into that information. So we'll see a demonstration of how those folder structures and where the data is actually the same across Teams and SharePoint. So I'll talk about how that relationship between the two actually works. Across Teams and SharePoint, we get a functionality such as view, edit, and co-authoring. And we can do that internally and externally as well. So if Pentium Hydro allows it, you can potentially connect with external vendors or people and collaborate and work on information as well. And all that is governed by permissions that are set up in the back end. So if somebody doesn't have access to information, they won't see it, whether they're internal or external. So through this session, we're going to try and look at SharePoint and Teams. We're going to divide this up evenly across the board. I'll touch on source of truth. So we'll look at how data, when it's in SharePoint, is that source of truth. It's the original version and why we want it to stay that way. We'll quickly look at how we can create, edit, and manage our data in SharePoint. Also collaboration, we can definitely do that through SharePoint, which is co-authoring. So if I have a file open, somebody else can be in that same file with me and working. And we'll also look at how the search functions as well. So let's do that now. Let's go into SharePoint. Now I've got a few tabs and whatnot already open. The first screen that we're looking at here is actually the SharePoint start page. Now, you might not necessarily start at this point when you open your browser, but here we can see there's a bunch of sites that are showing on my screen, and there's also a suggested site here. So SharePoint Online is made up of sites. So these are actually groups, and we can see that in the subtitle here. It says it's a group, which is essentially a group of people that are members of that site. And that transposes into Teams. So that team you see in the Teams interface is actually the group here on SharePoint. So if that connection has been made through a configuration setting that probably your IT team will have organized, you'll get that connection between the two platforms. But this is one screen that you could potentially use to navigate to different sites, or perhaps you have a default homepage that starts whenever you open your browser. I'm not too sure on how that actually works for everybody. But as far as working with data and looking and working in these sites, we just select a particular site. And this is the homepage for this site. Now, how do we actually identify the connection between teams here? There's a number of ways we can do that. The easiest way is if we get this little Teams icon that appears next to the site name at the top there. That's also a link back to Teams as well. So when we select this, it will take us to the Teams interface and it will take us directly to the channel for this particular team. So let's do that now. So it always opens that web page for you, but if you've already got the desktop app running, it'll automatically go to that channel. So here we are in that same team that we saw in SharePoint. We've been taken directly to the channel that we selected, which is the general. And here we can start accessing our information that also lives in SharePoint. So looking at this folder structure here, if we go back to SharePoint, and if we navigate to documents on the left here, and there's our general channel, and there's that folder structure. So if we see that folder structure here, and then in Teams, there's that same folder structure. So that's another way to identify that the data is actually living in SharePoint and we're accessing it through Teams. Now you will note, yep, sorry.
Just a quick one on that SharePoint, how you got that Teams link there on SharePoint back to Teams.
Yep.
Is that for only the folder owner or is it for everyone? Because there's certain files and folders that we've got that don't have that linkage.
It's to the actual channel in Teams, not to a folder.
Yeah, because I'm an owner of a safety and risk and I have got the little icon.
Yeah, members and owners should get that icon. There's no reason they shouldn't.
Well, Sue's a member of finance and it doesn't come up on her screen with that little Teams icon, but I'll take a note of that.
Yeah, so if that Teams icon is not present, that usually indicates that the SharePoint site isn't actually linked to a team yet. So that's something that actually has to be activated. So it's not by default every time. Usually when you create a SharePoint site for the first time, in the bottom left here, you'll actually get a prompt that comes up going, do you want to create a team for this site?
Yeah.
So when you do that, that's when you get the icon. So maybe the finance team doesn't actually have a team yet.
Oh, it doesn't. Yeah, no.
There's a team in Teams.
Yeah, but that team in Teams might not actually be this SharePoint site. Yeah. So that,
yeah,
that's something to point out is that even though I'm demonstrating the link between these two systems here, they can still operate independently. You can still have a SharePoint site that isn't connected to Teams and vice versa. So that's why I'm highlighting this little icon is because that's indicator going, oh, this is actually a team as well. It's not just a SharePoint site. So yeah, that might be something to look into, Quinton, to see if that's actually linked through Teams.
Yeah, copy.
Awesome. Also, another way to get back to that Teams channel, as we can see in our ribbon here, go to channel. So that's when we've got the documents on the left here selected. So if you haven't already noticed, when we're on a SharePoint site, navigation is pretty straightforward. It's mainly just here on the left side of the screen. We get a various links that we can select and they all have their own individual purpose. They all speak for themselves. The only time this might be different is you might have some additional links that have been added, but usually they're descriptive, so you can work out what they are. So documents obviously goes to documents. We can also use this section here just above that folder structure as a navigation going back to where we started. So I can select documents and go back to the root folder, which is the channel itself. Sometimes you might actually see this difference here in what's displayed. So you can see we have a category for in channels and site library. This is another example of how SharePoint and Teams can sometimes be independent of each other. anything that's under this Insight library is not only connected to Teams, but also might only be for the SharePoint side as well. Whereas if it's under this category in channels, if there was multiple here, we would know they're all channels within the team on the Teams interface. And there's our little Teams icon to give us that indication. Even though we know this is a channel in the team as well, it's still part of SharePoint. So we could have another folder here that is independent of the team itself. So it's just something to be mindful of if you're expecting to find data in Teams, but it's not showing for some reason. It's possible that whoever created that folder or added that file has put it in a section in the SharePoint site that isn't actually connected into the team just yet. So you can come back to the SharePoint site to try and find that. And to do that, we can follow a similar process through the Teams interface that we did in SharePoint. When we are on the channel here, so if we have the channel selected, we get an option here that says open in SharePoint. So we can get that link back to SharePoint as well. So when I select that, it takes me directly to that folder structure under the general channel there. So I can close that one. Some other things to look at here, just general interfaces, you'll always see a ribbon across the top of not only Teams, but also SharePoint. The options might change slightly across both platforms, but generally they're pretty the same. You get the new and upload option on each side. The sharing option is very useful. So if you want to share a particular file or a folder with an individual or even a group of people, we can use the email link or the copy link. The email link will actually send an Outlook email to the selected person or people with the information about the link that they can actually click on through Outlook. And you can even add some context. Maybe that link isn't very descriptive. You can add a message to go, this is what this link is about. And that becomes a shared link. And you can actually see who that link will actually be shared with. Typically, you'll see this as groups that are shared with, not necessarily individuals. So it'd be Pentium Hydro members, owners, visitors, but sometimes it might be an individual that you see in this list down here. We can make some adjustments to how we share the link as well. So we can change how people interact with that link. Perhaps we are just asking people to review the information. We don't want them to edit. We can restrict that by using the can view option. Now, it is important to note that typically members and owners that are in groups that have that membership role, they will probably inherit the edit rights regardless. But perhaps you're sharing a file to somebody that doesn't have access to the particular group. They will get the link to the file that you're sharing, but they won't see the other information that's part of the team or the site. And you can restrict that editing or viewing through this setting. And if we select this line item here next to the item, next to the icon, we can change the particular groups of people as well. So if we want to let everybody that has access to the team, we choose the Pentium portal option, or maybe we're doing a revision of a document, so we just need the people with existing access so we can maintain that privacy. Or perhaps you're just working with one particular person, you can choose specific people. So let's just cancel that. With the copy option, the difference here is you're not using the Outlook to send the link, you're literally copy pasting. So you copy a link and you paste it to your desired location. I use this function in Teams a lot. So I'll copy the link from here in SharePoint, but then I'll paste it as a message in Teams. And when they actually select that link in the Teams chat, it'll take them to the SharePoint location because that's where I copied the link from. But you can do that in Teams as well. So we can definitely share a particular file or folder from Teams, just like we did in SharePoint. And here we get that share option again, and there's our email link and copy link options. So that interface is still the same, even though we're in Teams. The functionality is still the same. So it's consistent across both sides. And if I was to share a link from the Teams side, and when the person activates that link, it'll take them to the Teams interface instead. Or if you shared it from SharePoint, it will take them to the SharePoint location. Just a couple other things to point out. I'll select one of these particular documents and you'll notice that I'm using this circle that appears to select items. This is to highlight it. So if I was to actually click on the file name here, it would open the document. So if I just want to interact with the information on the screen and not go into the document, I use these check marks. When I have a file selected, you may have noticed that some of these options have now changed in the ribbon. Some of these options might also differ for some people. And again, this is locked behind permissions. So perhaps you don't have the ability to delete a file. This might be grayed out or it might not even be visible. Obviously, my permissions are a little bit more higher than most because I need to be able to demonstrate all the different functionality for training. But some of you might have a little bit more restriction around your permissions. Of course, if you don't believe that's correct, you can go through your normal support channels to have that looked at if that's required. But here we have download, delete, pin to top is a really good one. So if there's a particular file that you're working on a daily basis, perhaps, and you're in a large list of documents, when you use the pin to top, it makes it nice and bold up the top there and always accessible. So that's a way that you can be efficient with working with your information. And if we hover over that and use the check mark again, we can edit the pin and take it off there. So perhaps where we don't want it up there anymore, we just unpin it. Renaming is really easy in SharePoint and also Teams. I don't know anybody that's tried to rename files in File Explorer. Sometimes it's a little bit hit and miss, but here it's just really easy, nice interface, quick name change. And because we're doing that from SharePoint, it saves automatically. We don't have to worry about that not actually coming through. The move to is a great function. So perhaps you've got a folder of draft content and then you need to move it into a published folder. As an example, I've got a few organizations I've worked with that take that approach. So using the move to function is the way that how you would normally experience your drag and drop in File Explorer. This is how we do this in SharePoint, because drag and drop unfortunately doesn't work in SharePoint Online or in Teams. But if we use the move to here, it opens up a little window here for us. And here we can see the current folders of the site that we're on. But we also get a list of other sites that we're members of. So if we're a member of a site, we will see it in the quick access or in the more places. If you're not a member of a site and you don't have access, you won't see it appear in this list. So if you've been instructed to move something to another site but you don't see it, you might have to get added to that site to be able to do so. But when we select another location, so let's just choose safety and risk, we now get access to that folder structure. And I can navigate through this as well, so I can find the correct folder that I'm trying to move a file to. Now, another feature to point out here is that we get a checkbox appear when we're trying to move an actual file. This checkbox won't appear if you're trying to move a folder. Unfortunately, that's not supported as yet. But what this checkbox down the bottom here does is it maintains the link to the file that you're moving around SharePoint. So if you weren't to use the checkbox and somebody went looking for that file that was in the original location, it's no longer there. And they're like, well, where is it? I can't see it because this checkbox wasn't used. When we use the checkbox, it will notify all the people that the file is currently shared with and say in an email it does it. And it's basically, hey, this file is being moved to this location. Here is the link to it. So it maintains that connection. So that prevents people losing information or being inefficient with their time because they're trying to troubleshoot where something is. And again, that doesn't work for folders, only for files. Let's not move that, let's cancel. Now the other option is copy to, which uses the same interface and the same process. But the downside with copy to is that you're making a duplicate of the original, whereas move to is taking the file from one location and putting it into another. So copy and download are probably the functions you want to avoid using in SharePoint Online unless you have an actual use case for that, because SharePoint Online is the source of truth. This is where the original files live, and it's the most up-to-date versions. So just try and use move to where possible and avoid the copy to function or download. Another option we get when we talk about that it's the current version is we get version history for our files. So with this selected, we get an outline of all the different versions for that particular document, and it could be extensive, there could be a lot. Here we only have one particular version. Versions get automatically numbered, so when there's a major change to a document, it'll get a new line here and a new version number, and it's sequential, so it'll go 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. But we also get some details about the version, so date and time, and who it was modified by. And potentially a version comments as well. So maybe it's a requested revision, a comment to say revised updates applied to this version, or whatever the comment may be. And we can actually interact with this as well. It's not just information. We can select this, which will take us to that particular version of the document. So we can do a quick review if that version is correct and restore it if we need to. Just some quality of life options here in this interface is some view and filtering options. So regardless of a file or folder selected, we've got this drop down here, which is your view options. So here we can change how this folder structure is presented to us. So using the tiles will actually make these folders larger. This might be more prevalent for a folder full of pictures, for instance. But we can also see in this Word document, we're actually getting a quick view of the title page. So it might be a useful way to quickly identify a document or even a PDF by just how it looks on that thumbnail. And with the filtering options, they're pretty straightforward, but very useful. So again, if this was a very extensive library full of information, we could perhaps use the document type to refine those results. So if there was a mixture of documents, or perhaps we know there's a particular individual that's responsible for reviewing of the information in this folder structure, we could select just that individual to only show those documents or folders. And of course, we've got a date range that we can specify, or we can do a specific one based on the modified dates that are in that column there. I'll just exit that. Another feature that might be useful for many reasons is the details pane. So again, we get a little brief view of the documents. Sometimes it loads nicely, sometimes it doesn't. But here you can see I can actually scroll through the document in this thumbnail image without actually going into the document. So sometimes you don't need to necessarily go into the document for that information. We can see who has access to the document. We get a name of the file path, any other additional metadata. So these might change and adjust over time. And we also get an activity log. So here we can do a quick review of what's happening with the information. And this will go up to 500 activities. So it could be quite extensive. It might be a very old document and you can actually go back and see all that activity. You might not necessarily need to scroll through all the activity, but maybe you need to understand what's happened in the last few days or something to see the progress of something perhaps. And we can also use this path option here to copy a link to this particular file. So just like that share option, when we have the copy, we can do it from here as well. So that's looking at accessing data within the SharePoint online interface. But quickly, we'll just look at how do we actually find this information as well. So I'm just going to go back to home. So perhaps we're not aware of all the folders and files within the structure. We want to use the search instead. So up the top of SharePoint Online, we always get a search bar appear, and it always has a phrase that appears as well. And this one is saying search this site. So what that's basically saying is that any term or phrase I enter into the search while I'm at this location, so this site, will search only this site. Now, if I wanted to search all of SharePoint, I could go back to that SharePoint start page, which I can use this home icon on the left. And the search bar is still maintained at the top there. I get a new phrase that says search in SharePoint. So I could use this page to search all of SharePoint for what I'm looking for. And you'll notice that I'm starting to get some dynamic content already coming through, and I haven't actually entered a term. So SharePoint, in a way, tracks your activity to a degree. It recognizes the frequent sites and files and people that you're interacting with, and it starts to use that information to help refine the search for you. So it's noticing the frequent sites and files I've been looking at, and it's going, is this what you want? But if we wanted to find something specific, we could type in a pretty common word, and you can see that it's starting to dynamically filter for that phrase. Now, of course, I'm going to get a lot of results for the phrase safety, but for the demonstration, I wanted to show you the variety that you'll get. So we can see that there is a site in the search results and not just files, but there's also people as well. Now, if I wanted to see more information, I could press enter without selecting one of these options, or choose the show more results. And this is the SharePoint search interface from this point of view. And here we can see that variety of options when we've got the all category selected. We can see the reason it's pulling through Brad as a contact is because he's the safety and risk manager. So it's pulling off that safety word. Here we can see it's got the team because of the word safety, a folder and a file. But perhaps we only want to see files, so we just select the files category to get rid of all that other noise that was up there. But there's still a lot of different results here. There's even a notebook here. So maybe I need to go a little bit further. So perhaps I'm looking for a Word document. By using the file type filter here, we can then refine this search down just based on the type of document. But we can go another step further and look at modified date. So maybe in the past week. So it's taking a second there. But you get the general idea. You can use these filters and categories to help refine that down a little bit. Let's just clear those. So with the categories, we can also select sites here. So maybe there's multiple sites with a similar name. We can try and find a particular one that we're looking for. Perhaps we're a new starter and we're not familiar with everybody within the safety team. We can use that search term to find who those people are. So we can quickly identify who our manager and our superintendent is. Even news, so as news gets created and populated on SharePoint, we can use search to find those news articles as well. And images are the same principle. So as images are uploaded and has that phrase in either the person or the image name, we will see that information through images. So that's covering working with the documents and also looking at search. Just a couple other things to point out. We've got a quality of life option, which is called the following. So you may have noticed that on that SharePoint start page, I had a bunch of different sites and they all had a star on them. In the top right here, we get that following option. So perhaps it's your particular site that you frequent quite often. You can use that following to get back to it really quickly. Or perhaps you want to unfollow, you just select that following option and that will appear in that SharePoint start page. There we go. It takes a second for that to refresh so that I can click it back on again. On the left, we looked at how to get to the SharePoint homepage from that icon there. This is the SharePoint app bar on the left. So here instead of going back into that SharePoint start page, we can open up just a brief summary of those frequent and followed sites. We can do this for files as well and also news. So any news that SharePoint is recommending for us, and this might be based on news that you've actually looked at or you've saved for later reading. Files will show you files that you're either the creator of, you've co-authored or edited, and you have access to. So again, permissions wise, if you don't have access to a particular file, you won't see it appear in this list. And the same principle for lists here, SharePoint Online Lists is similar to Excel, but it's just the SharePoint version. So if you're tasked with creating lists or managing them, you would see them here. And all this content that appears in the SharePoint app bar is unique to each individual that uses it. So you won't see other people's files, you won't get the same view as them because it's unique to your account. So we've got about 30 minutes to go. So let's have a look at Teams now and just walk through some of the similarities that we just saw in SharePoint there. So we've already looked at that folder structure and the similarities. We've got the same ribbon with similar options as well. When I have a file selected, I still get the download, the delete, our rename, our move to, copy to, all that functionality is still there. It's just in the Teams interface. We get a couple of extra ones. So for instance, I can open this file directly in SharePoint through here in Teams. We get our same view option, so we can change the way that this folder structure looks, same as SharePoint. We get our same filter options as well. And also we still get the same detail options too. So we can see how this is almost a mirror of SharePoint, but obviously Teams brings with it its own functionalities, which is great for everyday working. So making calls, chatting with colleagues and collaborating and so forth. And we do that through all these different tabs here on the left. But specific for your organization, for Pentium Hydro, you may have noticed that these particular two folders here, we didn't see them in SharePoint. They are technically folders, but they're actually acting as a link to a folder that's on a different SharePoint site. So what Quinton and his team are doing is making things a bit easier for everybody to access the same information. So we've got our, this is your controlled documents, if you will. So the quality manuals and procedures and so forth. And you'll probably see that these two folders consistently across multiple different teams. It's to help you get to this useful information really quickly. But I still get the same functionality as previously. So if I've got a particular file selected, I can open it in SharePoint as long as I've got permissions and access to it. Obviously, we don't necessarily want to be using the download and copy to function, especially for these organizational specific documents. But you will notice that they all have this pen with a line through it symbol. That essentially means that this information is read-only. So even though you might have edit rights to other documents within the other folders, these ones have got their own unique permission. So yes, you can read it, you can look at it, but you're not allowed to edit it. And that's what that symbol means. So if you ever encounter an issue where you try to edit something, it's probably because it's got its own unique permissions. Same with the Pentium people. This is also a link to a different SharePoint site, but for convenience, it's here and available, and you also get that read-only symbol again. And these are almost like your intranet style documentation. So perhaps a contact list here we can see, find out who's who in the zoo. Industry news, job descriptions, and so forth. And there's another example of why this folder is a link. We get that little link symbol. If anybody's worked in Word and you add a link, that's the universal symbol for a link. But we still get that same function we can open in SharePoint. There's other things that come in Teams that you don't get in SharePoint, such as these tabs across the top. And these will be unique across every team, and they will change and adjust as required. By default, you'll always get a posts and a files tab. Every new team has that. It's a core part of a team. But here we can see we've got a tab that links directly to the YouTube for Pentium Hydro, and you can see that it's all within the Teams interface. So you don't necessarily have to go to YouTube for this information. You can consume this right here within Teams. Of course, we can interact with this and go to YouTube and so forth. And we have the learning portal as well. And these are all external entities. They're not living in Teams or SharePoint. This is us linking out to that information. So there's an example of why Teams is a productivity hub, because it adds this additional functionality that we can't get at anywhere else. If we look at the safety and risk here, we get that post and files as our default tabs across the top. But now you can see there's a variety of other different tabs that weren't in the Pentium Hydro. So, and these tabs are usually going to be well thought out. So they're there for a reason, because it's for the purpose of this particular team. And you will see things that are consistent, like the YouTube tab, because Pentium Hydro believes that's something that they want every team to have. Now, on some occasions, because there will be multiple teams that you might be members of that will be slightly different to these, you might see a plus symbol appear at the top here. If you have that access and the rights to do so, that's an option to add additional either links to external items or potentially a file or an app. But generally the structure is the same, and just some of the things will change over time. So let's just quickly go through some of the different things here in Teams for anybody that's not familiar with the Teams interface. The left side here, I refer to these as tabs. They're technically called apps, but for simplicity, we'll call these tabs as well. The top one here being activity. Now, this is just a running log of all the various activities that will happen across your team's experience. Here we can see this one is a missed call from Quinton, and it's giving us the call interface. So if we were to select the calls tab on the left, the interface is quite similar. It's all related to that call activity and that information. So it brings that over through into the activity as well. We don't necessarily have to go to the calls tab to have the same functionality. If I select the upside down pyramid here, this gives us a search option. So perhaps you've got lots and lots of activity, which will happen over time because it's persistent. It doesn't disappear, it just moves down the list. You can use the search to go through all that activity. But here we can see an example of the different activities that you will see in this list. So when people mention you, when they reply to your conversation or post, even reaction. So if somebody uses a thumbs up to a message you've posted, you'll get an activity for that. Moving down to chat here, you'll notice that the layout of the interface is pretty much the same. It's just what's shown on that main right side just changes to reflect what you're selecting. So this whole left side is essentially navigation. And here we've got various different types of chat on the left here. So the current one we have selected is the current team session that we're in. So I can actually not only present, but I can use this interface to actually communicate with everybody during the meeting. And this will apply to every meeting that you have, whether it's a scheduled meeting or an ad hoc meeting, you always get a chat interface. Depending on if you're the organizer of the meeting, you do get some additional options up here. So here I get a files, I can do an attendance report, we can do meeting notes during a meeting as well. There's even cool things like whiteboard. So it's a digital whiteboard. We can actually draw on our Teams interface, so jot down ideas or something. If we select a different type of chat, so this is a group chat. So similar to a meeting is a group of people, but this one's actually by design. It's not necessarily an actual meeting. This was set up as an actual group between 3 people. So a group chat needs to have 3 or more people to become a group chat, and all chat is persistent as well. So when you create a chat, whether it's group or a one-on-one, it'll always be there on that left navigation. You'll notice that we're getting tabs as well. So similar to the team, we've got tabs across the top. So we're getting files as well in our chat and not just in Teams. So here you could have a list of all files that are being shared between you and another person or a group of people. So if we go back to that Teams training here and select files, there is a list of the files that are being captured within this particular training session. So we've been running the same training session over the course of the last 3 weeks. So everything has been persistent through that meeting agenda and so forth. Within the chat interface, you can also do additional function that isn't necessarily chat related. So you can quickly start a video or a call with people using the icons across the top. We can pop out our start a screen share, sorry. We can see who the members of the particular group are because it's not quite easily visible here. If this was a long list of conversation, we wouldn't be able to see who those members were. So we can quickly add or leave a chat. And we can pop out the chat into a new window. So perhaps maybe somebody likes to do split screen. So you've got your Teams interface split down the middle and your chat windows on the other side. And we can just close that and it still maintains the chat interface. A one-on-one conversation, again, similar to group chat, but this is just one-on-one. Again, we get the files here at the top and that shows us a file that Quinton has shared with me. We get different tabs changing slightly. We get organization here, activity, and there's also a LinkedIn, so we can go check out Quinton on LinkedIn. And there's that plus symbol that I was referring to. So here we can add additional tabs of our own. So perhaps there is an Excel file that Quinton and I are working on. I can add the Excel tab and select an actual Excel file for quick access. Just as an example. That's it for those chat functions. To start a new chat for anybody that isn't aware, so when we looked at activity, we used that little upside down pyramid to go into search. That same function is here in the chat window. So again, we can search an extensive list of chat because they will be persistent. They don't delete, but we can use the search. But we can also look at the different types of chats. So we can filter by meeting chats, normal chats, unread perhaps. And there's also apps and muted there. But to start a new chat, we just select that little, it's like a square with a pen in the middle next to the upside down pyramid. So this opens up a new chat window and we just need to add a person to start a conversation. Now, when I select Quinton here, it's actually going to automatically go back to our conversation we've already had. That's because chat is actually unique, except for groups. So individual one-on-one conversations will always be maintained as a one conversation. It's just a chat log. You can't have duplicate chats with the same people. You can't do that for group chat, so you can have multiple groups with either the same people or a mix of people, and you'll see that in your list on the left. And also meeting conversations, there'll also be multiples of those. So that's an example of how we can maintain our information and it's consistent. We don't have to worry about the conversations being spread across different chat interfaces. It will always take us to our original. But if we were trying to have a conversation with a new person, I'm just going to type a random letter here. So if I was to select Aiden here, because I've never had a conversation with Aiden, as soon as I send him a message, it will start a new chat log. So it'll add it to that list on the left. I'm not going to do that though. I'm going to cancel this. So to cancel, I just go discard. And that gets rid of it. Just a couple of other useful things in a chat interface that some people might not be aware of. Our chat box is along the bottom there. This is where we type our message. Something that catches a lot of people out, and it's done it to me multiple times, is you start typing a message and you're halfway through a long message and you accidentally press enter because muscle memory or whatever, and it sends a message that's half completed and you're like, oh, how embarrassing. If you want to prevent that from happening, we use this first little icon here, which is the format. So with that selected, we not only get a bunch of formatting options here, but now when we press enter, it actually gives us a new line. So we can create a new paragraph or a new sentence, and that will prevent us from accidentally sending our message too early. Now, of course, we can't send the message with enter when we've got the format option open. So to do that, we need to use the arrow on the far right, which is the send. But we can also just select the trash can as well to delete this particular message. You'll notice there's a bunch of other options down here that you can look at as well. A lot of these are more app related, but you can mark a message as important. So if we open up the formatting there, I type that hi. So when I click select delivery option, I can mark it as important or urgent. And it actually brings some color and some urgency to the message as well. So it's not just, I know in Outlook, when you mark something as priority or urgent, you only get a little exclamation mark. It's not very visible. But here in Teams, it really highlights the fact that, hey, you want this to be urgent. And the important one is a little bit less intrusive, but that's a great way to get people's attention. The formatting is pretty straightforward. All the options you would expect to see in a Word document, but also here in Teams. We can attach to our chat messages as well. And here is an example of that OneDrive experience. So because this is a conversation with an individual, even though I'm doing it through Pentium Hydro Teams, my Teams, organization account, the only options there are OneDrive and upload from computer. That's when we use the attachment option. So if I select OneDrive, it only accesses my actual OneDrive account. Even though it's Pentium Hydro, it's the files that are unique to me. So how do we get around that? How do I share an actual organizational specific document not using OneDrive? That's where we use that copy link function. So if we go back to SharePoint as an example here, I'll just quickly navigate to a document. So I'll select this one as an example. Using the share, I'll copy link. And I won't make any changes and just copy that. Now going back to the Teams interface, I'll just do Control V with my keyboard, and that's pasting that particular document within the organization. So I'm not using OneDrive here, I'm using SharePoint. So that's how we can do an attachment here in the Teams. If it was a OneDrive file that you want to share, you can definitely do that. And also the upload from computer, which is the traditional way that you understand, which opens your file explorer. Now, I'm not going to send this, obviously, I'm just demonstrating it. But a cool feature here is we can actually manage the permissions of the file, even though we've pasted the link. So if I actually select this little drop down here, I'm getting those options we saw in SharePoint when we use the share function. We can change how we actually give permissions to it and also those view and edit rights to the file. So perhaps I forgot to do that when I copied the link. I can quickly adjust that before I hit send. You also don't need to send the actual image. You can have just the link, so you can actually press X here. The link maintains, it just takes that visual element out of it. But yeah, let's just delete that, discard. And just some of the other options here, the emojis you might use. Here at Sharing Minds, we use GIFs a lot, especially for birthdays. They're all PG friendly. You're not going to get anything that is not suitable for viewing. It'll all be friendly content. So we use this for celebrating people's birthdays. They're sticky notes and so forth.
One thing there, Corey, there's an option for the memes where you can add your own photo and make your own meme. So
there is
a risk you can get out of control.
Okay, I wasn't aware of that. Okay.
It will take long for us to find out, don't worry.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, so I guess, calling that out, be mindful that you're in an organizational setting, adhere to your own policies and procedures when it comes to that kind of content. Yeah, let's move on. We've got a few minutes to go. So again, here on the Teams tab, it's pretty straightforward. You get a list of all the different teams that you are a member of. If you're not a member, you won't see the team at all. Some teams might have multiple channels that you can select between. By default, you'll always start with a general, but they can have additional channels added, which will have their own file structure, their own tabs, They're specific to actual channels. Calendar, which is actually directly links to your Outlook. So here we can see the Teams training sessions that I actually created in Outlook, and they automatically came through the Teams interface. To create you can create a new calendar event here that will link to your Teams. So when you just select a time window, you get a similar interface to Outlook. It's the same kind of structure. You add your title, your people, your time, and so forth, and your agenda. You also get the scheduling assist as well, which is really useful. And because it is linked into the organization and Outlook, you'll see other people's attendance and their availability. And the great thing about doing it here in Teams is when you create a calendar event here in Teams, it's automatically a Teams meeting. So you don't need to toggle that option when you're in Outlook. The calls interface is pretty straightforward. You'll get a history log down the main screen there of all the different call types that you've had. So across missed, incoming, and potentially voicemail if that is set up. The files section is pretty straightforward. Here on the recent, obviously we see all the recent files that we've interacted with or that we're the owners of. We also get an indication of where those files actually live. So we can see that these particular videos here of the recorded training is living in the SharePoint site, so the Pentium Hydro operations. But here we can see another example of OneDrive. So when you record in Teams, I should say, it automatically saves to your OneDrive account. And it creates a new folder called recordings. So that's something to be mindful of. If you're recording videos, you need to take them out of OneDrive and put them in SharePoint if you want to prevent them from being deleted. We'll just quickly go back to chat and I'll show you what I'm actually talking about. Here we can see those previous training sessions have been recorded, and that little warning there says that it's set to expire. This is default behavior. This isn't Pentium doing this. It's Microsoft's way of trying to manage how much data they're actually storing on their servers. So a few months back, they made it all video recordings go to your personal OneDrive, and they have an expiry date. So you need to take it off OneDrive, put it on SharePoint, and adjust the expiry. It's a little bit painful. It used to be so much simpler, but hey, Microsoft. Just another option here, the team. So any team that you're a member of or files that you have permission to access, you can see a complete log of all that information. We get some details also, again, location. We can see nearly every single one of these starts with sites. There's another example how all the data is actually living in SharePoint and Teams is linking into it or viewing the information. We get some quality of life, who modified and how long ago. We can interact with this information so we can access a file from this interface. And if we select the three dots, we can open in our desktop app if we prefer, and there's a downloaded copy link. Now the downloads option is something to be mindful of. Downloads functions the same as if you download it off a website. It'll go to whatever downloads folder that you have set up. Usually by default, it's just the downloads folder for your PC. So if I select this, we can see that it's gone to this PC/downloads. You can change this location, but it's just important to understand that when you download in the Teams interface, it's going to your local machine and it's not going to a cloud location. So that brings me back to what I said when we're looking at SharePoint, is using download and copy to are probably the options you want to avoid to make sure that organizational information is stored in SharePoint and it lives there so that it is the source of truth. The OneDrive option here, again, is unique to you as an individual. It's your personal storage, so it's not organizational specific. Yes, I can share content from here to organizational people, but it's still private to me in the sense that it's part of my account and not part of Pentium Hydro. So I wouldn't recommend leaving anything that is organizational specific in here at all or work from here at all. Of course, Microsoft is forcing us to use this for our recordings, but we can quite easily come in here and move that data around. So I can actually select this and use the move option, like I demonstrated earlier, and we can find the team we want to move that information to. So that takes it out of our personal OneDrive and puts it into the organization. I mentioned that you can change this downloads folder. So just at the top here on the 3 dots, the top right, is our settings. We can access our interface here. There's multiple different settings you can play with here. There's graphical, how Teams actually looks. Some configuration around is Teams the registered app for chat, which I recommend that you have turned on if you haven't. We can change our language and so forth. But when it comes to managing where our data goes to, if we have to use the download, under files here, we can quickly change that destination. Now, I'm not going into the whole sync conversation, but if you are using sync to any degree and it's stable and you're happy with it, you could use that as the download location as an option. But just be mindful, if you are downloading in Teams, it will go to local device. You'll need to take it out of there and get it into SharePoint to make sure that it's available and source of truth. Just quickly before we finish up, another option here in Teams. For some of you, you might actually have a Visan account. So Visan being the parent of Pentium Hydro. You might need to switch to their interface and work on those particular files, for instance. So when we select our little icon at the top here, which is our profile icon, we have an option here called Manage Accounts. This takes us into that settings interface, but directly to our account section. Now, if you had that Visan account or any other account for that matter, you would get it as a list or a line here in this interface. And you could actually select that and actually log into that other account while you're within the Teams interface. So you would then start working on those account-specific information. I don't have an example of that. Obviously, I've only got the Pentium account. We're at the time. Was there anything else that I didn't get to, Quinton, that you want me to quickly touch on before we close out?
No, I'm all good with that. Thanks, Corey. Unless anyone else has got anything, but I would ask that Lindsay and Dan just hang around for a couple of minutes and I'll just show them a couple of other bits and pieces.
Yeah.
Just in relation directly to those 2 files that you mentioned that were pinned to the top. And I will take that action away, Corey, to see if I can get some questions for next week's, Thursday's session.
Yeah, I feel like with the last 5 sessions has been all me talk, and because there's so much to cover, we really haven't had time for people to bring their questions to the table. So I'd really like Thursday to be an opportunity for everybody to do the talking and me try and help answer those questions. So if we could do that, that'd be awesome. But of course, we've got plenty of material to cover if that's not the case.
Yeah, no, all good. Well, I've been watching the videos on replay, mate. I'm pretty confident I could talk with a mouthful of arms underwater for about 30 minutes.
Yeah, and we're only scratching the surface here too. There's so much more that we haven't touched on that you'll become accustomed to and that you will learn through your use of the systems. So my encouragement to everybody is get hands-on and play around with the environments, get familiar, find your way of working. How you work and interact with information across Teams and SharePoint will be unique to you and not the same for everybody. I've demonstrated best practice and highlighted the common features and functions, but how you get to SharePoint from Teams, you might do differently to how I do it. I'm just trying to help everyone understand where all those options are.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Corey.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, everybody, for attending and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Thank you, mate.
Thank you.
All right, you there, Lindsay?